Good evening. So I have the pleasure of joining the stage with an incredible group of folks. And I'm not going to go through their bios because it's in your material and we have very limited time. But I just want to introduce them in the order in which they're sitting, which is not the order in which they will be speaking. Sitting to my immediate left is Anat Shenker-Osorio, and she's the founder. She is the founder and principal of ASO Communication, and she does tremendous research on issues of race and class, including using neuroscience. You can give us some love. Next to her is Ashley Woodard Henderson, who's the co-director of the Highland Research and Education Center and the first Black woman to hold that title. She's 33 years old, at least she was when they wrote this, and she identifies as a Appalachian, working class woman born and raised in Southeast Tennessee. Sitting next to her is Julie Nelson. And Julie is the senior vice president of programs of Race Forward. She's also the director of Government Alliance of Race and Equity, called GARE. So if government's doing innovative work around race and equity, it probably leads back to Julie. And Julie's also a good friend, so Julie. And Tarso Ramos, who is the executive director of Political Research Associate, a nonprofit organization that monitors right-wing groups and advance inclusion, multiracial democracy in partnership with social justice movements. So I'm going to make a few framing remarks and then turn it over to the panel and pose some questions to them. But first, I just want to say a couple of things. Some of you may have seen the movie Blind Side. How many saw that movie? All right. A movie that takes place in the Bay Area. And for those of you who didn't see it, the theme of the movie is a young black man who's on probation who sees a police killing another black person and how that sort of disrupts his life. I got a call yesterday from a young black man that I've been mentoring since he was in junior high school. He's now 27. And what he said is, I just saw police kill a black man. What should I do? I'm afraid. And I just mentioned that because we're all doing this work, and we think about it at different levels, but it's also very real and affect our lives. But I don't want to end on just a heavy note. I also want to tell you a joke. So how many racial justice activists do it take to actually change a light bulb? And the answer is, it's not the light bulb that needs changing. So this panel is looking at a dynamic that's affecting us in our personal lives, affecting us every day, but it also has reach that goes beyond our personal lives. And I'm talking about the rise of right-wing authoritarian governments around the world. And at this point in history, more than half the world is now governed by authoritarian regimes. And it's the first time in modern history that we've seen such a tremendous slide away from democracy to authoritarianism. And even though the democracies that populated the world were never fully democratic, and many of them were, as Michael Omi and Howard Winnet described, racial dictatorships, there was sort of aspiration to be more inclusive and to be more democratic. And that aspiration is actually being called into question. It's being called into question by a number of important dynamics and challenges that not only affects the United States, Donald Trump, it affects South Africa, it affects Russia, it affects India, it affects the Philippines, it affects Brazil, and we could go on and on and on. And so one of the questions that we have to deal with is, what does this mean? And how do we understand this? The impact of this is very real. It has an impact in terms of people's everyday life. It has an impact in our own efforts to sort of struggle for a inclusive, real democracy. And even though, again, all of us have grown up and lived in a society that's far less than perfect, the answer can't be authoritarian ethnic nationalism, which in the United States takes the form of white nationalism in particular, with a hard edge around race. But in India, it takes the form of religious nationalism with a hard edge around religion. And different places, it takes on this edge. And one thing that's consistent in all these expressions is a deep, diabolical, sinister making of the other. And the other takes on different forms. And again, how are we to sort of deal with this here in the United States? So, and also think about what's causing it at this particular time in history. The sort of explosion of authoritarian ethnic nationalism is really relatively new. If we were here, and some of us was here 4 years ago, we'd be talking about neoliberalism. And it was very real, still real. Neoliberalism is actually in decline right now. And to some extent, one could say neoliberalism, give it up for the death of neoliberalism. But the problem is, what we're getting in its place is worse than neoliberalism. And we hadn't anticipated that. And so how do we actually not just move away from neoliberalism? In fact, neoliberalism in many ways gave birth to fascism and neo-fascism. So that's not the birth we're looking for. We're looking for something different. And so part of the question then is, how do we begin to address that? And we have our respective speakers today, and they're more than speakers, they're friends, and they've all done incredible work to help us think about that. And in that context, one of the questions that the conference has asked, is America possible? Now that's a provocative question, but it's not just hyperbolic. We're actually watching potentially the disuniting of the United States. We're watching potentially the end of the European Union. And it's sort of interesting because in some ways you could say the sort of challenge to public space, the challenge to a pluralistic society happens at the very time that people of color and others start populating those institutions of democracy. So it's not surprising in some ways that Donald Trump follows Barack Obama. As imperfect as Barack Obama was, he represented something that for many right-wing Americans, and we should not call them conservative because they're not conservative, they're right-wingers. They're slipping back into a national white ethos, saying the country belongs to them and only them. And so how do we begin to deal with that? And then what do we go forward? If we go forward, if they prevail, if Donald Trump prevails, I would argue this. Not only is America not possible, but Europe is not possible, and I would say the world is not possible. If right-wing authoritarian nationalism prevails in the world is not possible. And we'll turn it over to my colleagues in a minute, but I want to leave you with this provocative thought. I gave a talk recently to a number of tech companies in the Bay Area, and they're obsessed with whether or not technology, and particularly robots and artificial intelligence, can coexist with human flourishing. It's a real question, whether or not there'll be work, whether or not the robots will take over. And these are some serious thinkers, so they're not just fluffing over ideas. And what I left them with is that unless we get the social right, we don't have to worry about robots. Robots won't have a chance to kill us. We'll kill ourselves before the robots do. And so you think about it, we had, particularly in Europe, we had 3 major wars in a little over 50 years. And they all were sort of organized to some extent around right-wing nationalism. And during that time, we had limited capacity because we didn't get the atomic bomb until the end of World War II. And Detroit was critical in terms of defeating Nazi. This is called the arsenal of democracy. but not everybody has the atomic bomb. And stuff that's even more pernicious than the atomic bomb. So these questions, if we don't get them right, as I suggested, we will not have a world to even fight about. So I'm going to start by turning it over to Anat and ask her to take on this question. And it's ridiculously short how little time we're going to give to deal with these big questions. So each of the panelists will have 5 minutes. I'll ask the second round of questions, which they'll only have 3 minutes, and then we'll close with one more set of questions. So, Anat, the question then is America possible in the frame of sort of right-wing nationalism? And the role, you write a lot about narrative. So how does narrative, and you talk about strategic narrative, how does it play into that? What's the narrative that will help us, or the narrative that will make this harder? And I'm going to sit down.
Thanks. Is this on? So I was thinking of just saying no, and then we could just go. But I would be remiss to not first just say how incredibly honored I am to be on this stage with these colleagues, and how incredibly freaky it is to have to close this conference. To sit next to a man of the esteem of John Powell, who is so seminal in this work, not to mention my other colleagues, that he's actually invented an entirely new genre of humor, the racial justice dad joke. But you're welcome, John. We were friends. So the first thing I want to say is just about narrative generally, and we've heard this a bit at this conference already, which is, what does a narrative do? And in very quick terms, what a narrative does is it helps us make sense of our present by offering us an origin story of our past, telling us who does what to whom, so that we can understand the conditions that we're in right now. And it offers us a vision of a beautiful tomorrow that is compelling and enticing enough that we would actually be willing to do the effort, to do the work, to come together to make it happen. The other thing a narrative does is that it recognizes that politics are not solitaire, and that the things that we say occur in context. And this dream of a delusional Washington insider class that believes that somehow we can colorblind economic populist our way to victory without naming race, or what they like to call identity politics, which in a functional country would be called human rights, but in this country is called identity politics. Politics are not solitaire, and so when there is a landscape, a never-ending drumbeat in this country and others of unabashed, unabated race baiting, if your narrative, if your message does not contend with the rest of what people are hearing, then your happy talk about free college is not going to break through when 2 hours earlier someone has knocked at that voter's door and said, MS-13 is coming to kill you. Because your answer to that is, that sounds lovely, free college, but I'm dead. So what our narrative does, and many of you hopefully are familiar with the race-class narrative, which is the work of an incredible amount of people, SEIU Racial Justice Center, Demos, my colleague and John's, Ian Haney-Lopez from Berkeley Law School, and the work of actually many of you. What the race-class narrative does is, first, it begins rooted in a shared value that explicitly names race. What that sounds like is something like, no matter our differences, no matter what we look like or where we come from, most of us want pretty similar things. It moves to a problem statement that, unlike a standard democratic or economic populist problem statement that just talks about plutocracy, it actually explains strategic racism by saying something like, but today, the wealthy few and the politicians they pay for have divided us against each other, or shame and blame people of color or new immigrants or Muslim Americans, depending on the geography you're using it in, so that they can turn around and steal the rest of our goods. It essentially explains plutocracy through the lens of intentional division, thereby weaving together race and class. It then ends with a call, again in explicit racial terms, joined together across racial difference, For the beautiful tomorrow, that could be to pick leaders that represent every one of us. That could be more broadly speaking outside of an electoral message so that we can make this a place where freedom and community are for everyone, no exceptions. Now, finally, since you asked, what a narrative does not do, what it does not do, and we know this through empirical testing, both nationally and in our target areas, is it does not conform to the all too common progressive standard, our favorite message, which is either, boy, have I got a problem for you, or this is the Titanic, would you like to buy a ticket? Or we're the losing team, we lose a lot, so join us. Those are things it doesn't do.
Thank you. I realized I got the order wrong. It was supposed to be Tarso that was supposed to go first. So, Tarso, you can go second. And speaking to the issue of the rise of right-wing populism, again, Tarso, you've done a lot of work in this area. Maybe you can help us understand more deeply what this means and what it means in terms of politics in the United States and what we should do about it.
Great, thank you, John, very much for that question. First, just mad respect to Race Forward for pulling together such an incredible event and for pulling together this important conversation. Boa tarde, buenas tardes, good afternoon to all of you. You are a beautiful sight to behold. I wish you all had this view. It's fantastic. So I was asked to talk a bit about authoritarianism. And I guess I want to start by confessing that I'm a preacher's kid. And probably like a lot of you, maybe some other preacher's kids in the audience, like a lot of you, perhaps I was raised to believe that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But I was also raised in a family that had to flee our homeland because democracy collapsed in Brazil under the weight of military dictatorship. And so I was raised with a knowledge, a painful knowledge that democracies, even democracies that are not particularly democratic, really, can and do fail. Right? And as John was pointing out, we are living in a global period right now in which liberal democracies are collapsing and we're experiencing the rise of authoritarianism. There are too many countries even to name in this process. You know, Hungary, Russia, Turkey, Brazil again, just a few examples. But from Milan, Italy, right, to Manila, Philippines, from Warsaw, Poland, to Washington, D.C., authoritarian movements, parties, politicians are on the rise around the globe. And as John pointed out, today more than half the population is governed by authoritarian rulers. It would be a mistake to think that what's happening in the United States is unconnected, right, to these global trend lines. And so I think it's important to step out of kind of American exceptionalism to look at what's happening around the world. Now, different from the past, democratic states that are failing these days typically are not ending in a kind of sudden event like a military coup. More typically, they're collapsing through the steady erosion and corruption of democratic institutions, right? Authoritarians are often elected, and then they undermine democracy from within. A trend that may sound familiar. So no country is the same, but I want to identify three common trends that we see in a lot of these situations and that I think will sound familiar to some of you. The first is severe economic inequality, right? The transfer of wealth upward and the concentration of it into few hands, creating stress and resentment. The second is the rise of theocratic religious movements that bring with them misogyny and homophobia and religious intolerance and enter into culture and politics and provide a mass base for reactionary governance. And the third is the rise of racial and ethnic nationalism, leaders and parties that define the people, the nation, in racist or other exclusionary terms, and John was giving some other examples of those. Seems like I just outlined the basic, coalition of Trumpism, right? So to the United States. There are some particular dynamics here, and it's worth pointing out that in the short history, in human history of the modern nation state, it is hard to identify an example of when a democracy survived the transition in which the dominant racial, ethnic, or religious group became a numerical minority, More typically, democracy is sacrificed in order to maintain the cultural, economic, and political dominance of that class, right? Just look at our own post-civil rights, post-civil war history, right? And rejecting multiracial democracy through Reconstruction, and instead we got racial terrorism and a one-party racial dictatorship across the South, and to this day we have racism in every corner of the country. So in these not-so-united states, we're experiencing all three of these global forces and some others, pushing us toward authoritarianism, plus the racial anxiety of white people losing their numerical majority. I would say that Trump and Trumpism are largely symptoms of those underlying dynamics, and because they're symptoms, they're not likely to go away anytime soon, even if Trump were to exit the stage. So, I have a confession. I no longer believe, as I once did, that the arc of history bends towards justice. What I conclude looking at all this is the arc of history bends towards those who are pulling the hardest on the arc of history. And so we better hope that who's pulling the hardest is all of us and a lot more to boot. And so we have to develop our pulling muscles, right? Our anti-authoritarian and our racial justice pulling muscles. So how do we get from here, right? Perhaps the brink of authoritarianism, just to bring the light, right? To the just inclusive multiracial democracy that we seek, right? The one that has never existed but lives in our hearts and in our heads, that lived in the aspirations and hopes of our ancestors, and that we hope for our children, right? I think the first step is to admit that these are in fact the stakes. If we think that the crisis that we're dealing with globally in the United States is only Trump deep, we are not going to make the strategic corrections that we need to make in order to actually win in this case, right? It took more than 40 years to get here. This is not a quick course correction we're going to get in 1 or 2 election cycles, as important as it is to engage in those pieces. And a second step, I think, is to accept and to convince others that the question of saving democracy or something like democracy and the question of winning a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy is, in fact, the same question, right? It's the same question, has always been, and is so more now than ever before. The racial justice movement is, at least in part, among other things, a democracy movement, and any movement calling itself a democracy movement that doesn't put racial justice at its center is not serious, is not a democracy movement, and is not going to get us out of this. So there may be no blueprint for where we need to go now, right? But we will build this because we must. This is our moment, this is our calling. And so I want to wrap by proposing 3 broad areas of work that I think can help carry us through. The first has to do with the battle for culture and imagination, right? We are in a fight as to who's the we, who gets to be an American, right? Who deserves to be here, whose country is this? And we have to fight and win that. In order to win the arena of politics and society, we have to build an enduring majority that believes in an inclusive, multiracial definition of we the people, and we have to fight for that. So there's narrative work there. Second, we need to block the right wing, whether that's the more theocratic, the more corporate oligarchy, right, or the white nationalists, from their ongoing capture and consolidation of democratic institutions, right? The vote, the courts, media and communications, government in general, right? We need to block them so we have the space to build. And then we have to build the practice of multiracial democracy in everything we do, right? We have to build the relationships. We have to build the experience of power sharing across difference, right? Among those of us who are actually going to build that future that we dream about. And a good place to start, as many folks are already doing, is to look around at the targets of white nationalism, right? We need to raft up together. So Black and Latinx people, Asian, Indigenous, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, immigrant, LGBTQ, feminists, and yes, white people who reject white supremacy and also long for racial justice. We have to build that practice of multiracial democracy if we have any hope of building and governing the society of our dreams. So block it. So fight for the who's the we, block the right, and build the future. This is our watch, right? This is our watch. It is our duty to fight. It is our duty to win. And venceremos.
Thank you. So Julie, everyone up here does incredible work, and Julie has done work for a long time trying to actually get our institutions to respond to some of these issues, and particularly our institution of the government. And so the question is, how do we actually get local government to respond to these national and global trends? How do we capture and use local government to actually respond to these trends? And many of you know the confidence in government is very, very low. People don't trust government anymore. And some studies show that the average American, only about 7% of the African American actually trust government, and the margin of error is more than 7%, so it might be zero. Julie.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon. I, like Tarso, just want to start by saying thanks. It's been an amazing couple of days, and it's a privilege and an honor to be here closing this out. And John, it is a fortuitous question because I have some experience with government. Many of you may know that I spent the bulk of my career working in local government. And as a young person, when I went into local government, if someone had told me that I was going to spend 23 years working in local government, I would have argued vehemently. It's like I was someone who was an activist. I thought of myself as a change maker. And the idea of spending nearly a quarter of a century in government would have been not what I aspired to. But I want to ask the question of the audience, and it's a little bit hard for me to see, so I want to see some hands waving strongly. If you currently work for government, would you raise your hand? Oh my God, keep them in the air. If you have ever worked for government, put your hands in the air and wave them. And if you use government, would you put your hands in the air? Okay, now, a question that I sometimes don't ask around government: if you've been used by government, would you raise your hand? Okay, so we have this complicated relationship with government. And when we think about government, it is a primary way in which we think about democracy. Do we have a democracy? And what I would submit to you is that we don't currently have a democracy. And so let's not fool ourselves about that. That really, if we want a democracy, we have to recognize power. That we have to be able to fundamentally shift power. Democracy's promise is that people have power, not just white, rich males, but all of us, right? So we're talking about people of color, women, LGBT, elders, young people, people with disabilities, that we fundamentally shift power in order to get to a democracy. And I'm not just talking about voting, that sometimes when we think about democracy, we think about the power of the vote. Now, power of voting is an incredible power, and we want to use that power, but it's not the full power of democracy. And so when we're thinking about democracy, moving beyond that vote, you know, whether people are voting or not, but just thinking about the communities that we have. Do people have access to affordable, safe housing? Do we have good jobs? Do we have good health outcomes? That if we have a democracy, those are the sorts of things that we are aspiring to. And so let's be clear, we do not currently live in a democracy, nor is the history of the United States one of democracy. That from the very foundation of this country was founded on white supremacy. And so the reality that when we have a country that is founded on the genocide of people, on the enslavement of people, on colonization, that is not democracy. So we have made a little bit of progress, but the reality is that some of the words that we use have changed, that we have to be able to celebrate the milestones that we have achieved, but we also have to recognize the huge work that lays before us. Have to recognize that racial inequities are not random, they're not natural. We have them because they were intentionally created, and that government played a key role, a primary role in the creation of those racial inequities. So laws, policies, practices, who could vote, who could be a citizen, who could own property, who was property, whose land was whose. That the reality of racial inequities being intentionally created, and that government played a primary role in making that happen. So, what are we doing now? Well, we may have stripped that explicitly racist language out of government policy and practice, but the reality is that we've still got government policy and practice that continues to maintain racial inequities. If we want to get to a democracy, we have got to be able to fundamentally transform government. It's not just transactional in nature. It's not just little tweaks around the edges where you change this policy or change that policy. To get to a democracy where actually we're working for the success of people and recognizing the marginalization of many. Want to say, well, the other thing I was going to confess, oh God, John's giving me the one, not that finger, the one finger mark. So when we're working within government, thinking about the strategies that we use, when there is tension and when there is history, we have to have a shared racial equity analysis. Have to understand that we're talking about institutions and structures and not just bad acts of individual people. That normalizing conversations about race is critical, but it's not enough. And so working within government, what the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is doing is really operationalizing racial equity, looking at those policies and practices, inserting benefits and burdens, asking the question who's benefiting and who's burdened of policy decisions and practice decisions. And then the third thing, I'm going to stop looking at you, John, is around organizing. And we talk about using an inside-outside model of organizing. 1 in 6 people in the United States works for government. The public sector is the largest employer of living wage jobs for people of color. So changing the public sector via an organizing model, inside organizing in collaboration with community, is absolutely essential for democracy. We will not be able to get to a multiracial democracy unless we fundamentally transform government. Thank you.
Thank you. So Ashley, we've heard a number of, actually all the speakers have talked about, to some extent, who's the we? And you've talked about this well. It's not just who's the we, but who tells the story. So can you talk about who the we is and who should tell the story?
Hey, family. I love y'all. So I think it's a good question, John. Before I do that, I have to, I come from a particular tradition that's both Black and Southern, and so I got to set protocol for me to be able to do this. I know there's a lot of conversation a lot of times about like ancestors sort of putting us in a trajectory to fight this good fight, right? And I think that that's true. But I also think what's real is there are elders in this room who I would not be doing what I'm doing in front of 3,500 people without. So if you're an elder, can you just raise your hand and wave at me? Can we acknowledge these elders in the room? And before I get into it, I just want to ask for your permission to speak to this crowd. Thank you. So now that that's been said, I again want to thank Race Forward. I want to say big ups to the comrades. Y'all are amazing. I want to shout out like my local DFAM who's hosting all these people in their neighborhood. Thank you. And the indigenous people that let us be on this land. I want to shout out the Southern and Appalachian people in this room. If you're Southern or Appalachian, can I get a whoop whoop? And I know some of the baddest activists, organizers, base builders, hellraisers in the land. The movement for Black Lives is in the room. If you're with the movement for Black Lives, can I get a whoop whoop? It's a blessing to be in your presence. So that's a good question, John. I'm going to answer it, I promise. I'm also going to take my rightful time doing it. So I think, I appreciate what the comrades have said. I think that the United States as a democracy is a myth. I just want to make sure that we name that, and it's a couple of, all 4 of us have said it, right? It's a myth. It's aspirational at best, and to be quite frank, the people who've had power, executive power in this country, didn't even mean it to be aspirational. It wasn't the point of this political project. And its structures are working exactly as they were intended to, right? It's not broken, right? It just doesn't serve us because it was never intended to. The point of this American project was never racial equity. But y'all know that, so I won't harp. Who the we is, right? Good question. I would say that, anybody come to Facing Race in 2016? Yeah. Anybody go in 2014? You remember in 2014 where black Southerners told y'all that Trump was gonna win? Crickets. Let me say it one more time because y'all might not. I'm a preacher's kid, I'm a missionary Baptist, and so I'm used to people talking back to me. I'm gonna ask one more time because that was actually not a question that I didn't want you not to answer. You remember when Southerners, particularly black ones, particularly black country, sometimes y'all use the word rural, that's not how we talk about ourselves, but you remember when black rural people were like, yo, man, Trump's gonna win? Anybody remember that? So when I think about who tells the story, I think about like, well, who's listening to those folks, right? But y'all know that too, so I won't harp. I think that a concrete analysis of concrete conditions makes good strategy. And I think that listening to who is most directly impacted, right? And we use that word, those words, that jargon very flippantly, right? But actually really looking at the work that Tarso's done, the sacrifices that folks like their organization have made, like many of you who are on the front lines base building every day, really listening to you and what you think strategically makes sense might get us out of some of the pickles we're in, though. And so if by now we're not at this point in this final hour of this conference when we've got like 12 minutes on the clock, we're just now starting to talk about what our vision is, I have questions. If we're just now starting to talk about what we're gonna do, I have concerns. Because what is Facing Race? What is Race Forward if not the 3,500 people in this room, right? What is the consequence if these people, you all, are not the ones that are supposed to be telling the story? And in fact, not only telling stories, my grandparents and great-grandparents and black people in this country have been telling our own stories for a long time. That ain't changed not a damn thing, right? So like, what are we gonna do? And what are we gonna be accountable to each other, this great cloud of witnesses, as they say, that have some responsibility to do something. So in 2020, when we come back together again, assuming that we're still here, I'm serious, assuming that we're still here, that we're not coming to spew our electoral trauma, but to talk about we tried some shit, right? And this is what we got right, and this is where we still need to go, because I fear that if we don't tell those stories and have those conversations, that 2020 is a wrap. And then we won't be talking about, like, oh, it's unfortunate that Trump won, or it's crap that, like, Stacey still has to be fighting, or that Andrew Gillum has to be fighting still, right? We'll be talking about how they now have a 30-year plan that they're implementing for us to be, set, right? All right, I know, I see your finger, John. I promise I do. And I swear I respect you, and I'm gonna fix this in a minute. So democracy, right? Can I be honest? As opposed to what you write or not. Democracy, the only time democracy has existed is when we did it, right? It's ours. It's only existed when we made it so, right? And to be quite honest, there's been a lot of conversation in this conference about like white people, rich white men, mediocre ass white women, right? That I've heard it, and I'm mad too, y'all. Like, I was in Georgia. I'm mad. My daddy lives there. Like, I'm mad too. But it's actually, it's not about them. And we spent so much time at this conference talking about them, and very little time now that there's 10 minutes on the clock talking about what the hell we're gonna do. My comrades in Black Voters Matter, Latasha Brown and Cliff Albright, have said, yeah, they deserve that chair. Have said from day one that it's not about them. It's about us. It's about us. It's about our power, right? We talk a lot about government, and we should. Inside-outside strategies are smart. And there's a very fundamental difference between government and governance. And I don't need this government to self-determine what happens in my community. Neither do you. I think it's important to remember that like our revolutionary vision, and I said that word on purpose, our revolutionary visionary muscles can no longer be atrophied, y'all. The flip of that coin is that we can't also just keep throwing tactical spaghetti at the wall and hoping something sticks. So, in conclusion, let's use our visionary muscles. Let's imagine some stuff together. Let's take some risks, yeah? How about we stop, you know, y'all see me being intentional, yeah? Can y'all see this? How about we not concede? How about we not concede territory? How about we not concede our people, even the ones that drive us up a wall? Right? How about we not concede the ones of us that aren't the sexy, visible ones? How about we not concede what we actually deserve? So often we're making demands about what we would concede to, not what we deserve. How about we not concede our faith? You can't tell me that white evangelicals have more of a right to Christianity than I do. You can't tell me that Zionists have more right to Judaism than white anti-racist Jews that are in this room. I said it. They're going to come for me too. How about we not concede our cultural practices for the sake of efficiency? That doesn't work. And how about we not concede our democratic alternatives to self-determination that are led by our people? Saving democracy is about us taking back what was stolen from us, right? Really smart black people have said for forever, from Africa to people in the States like Toni Morrison, that what white supremacists, they don't say it necessarily like this, I'm gonna say it in a super like politicized way, because I'm woke and shit. It's like, white supremacy and capitalism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and all of the things, all the systemic structures that people created them. Those structures have literally dismembered us. They've dismembered us from each other. They've dismembered us from our homelands. They've dismembered us from our faith and cultural practices, right? And the role, I think, of people of goodwill, whether they identify as organizers or activists or not, is to remember. Is to literally remember those stories, to remember our communities, right? And we can't do that and build democracy without talking about truth and justice before demanding reconciliation. We don't get peace without truth and justice, right? So finally, one of my mentors and a Highlander fam, Vincent Harding, anybody heard that name? So the last time that he was physically with us at Highlander was our 80th homecoming. Y'all know we're 86 years old this year. And he wrote a full-page note in a guest book that's in the house that I live in there. And it said a bunch of stuff in it. It said, you know, y'all doing good work, go right on. For those of you that know him, know that that's like something he would say. And he said at the end, the last sentence that I literally carry with me everywhere I go, is that a new America needs to be born. It still needs to be born. Let us be the midwives. Right? I'm gonna say it one more time for the people in the back that maybe didn't hear it. He said, a new America still needs to be born, right? That actually the America that we get talked about and taught about doesn't exist. The new one, though, that new America still needs to happen. It still needs to be born. Let us be the midwives, right? And so when I see y'all in these streets or in these Senate chambers or, you know, chasing ballots or shutting streets down or knocking on the whatever you do, I just want us to remember that it won't be Trump that keeps us from it, that new America. I don't believe that. It won't be white nationalists. I don't believe that either, right? I don't get into fights I don't think I can win, and I think I could beat them, right? It won't be the fault or the successes of 20th century movement that keep us from it, necessarily. right? We can blame Martin Luther King and all of them all day long, right? But it won't be them that keeps us from it. We are the midwives. And birthing, anybody that's been there or done that, knows that's a messy, messy, messy process in all of its beauty. And so I'm not telling you that I expect perfection from the 3,500 people in this room. What I am telling you is that I think it still requires us to do something, to be accountable to somebody. And I think that that is our basis, the people that we're bringing in on our shoulders in this room and to each other. And I'm hoping that before the 5 minutes on this clock run out, we get a little bit closer to deciding what that's going to be. Thank you.
So we've had some challenges, and I want to have each of the presenters come back. I want to frame this last set of questions, and then we'll close. There's some things pushing us, not just the United States, but the whole world, toward authoritarianism. And I want to name what some of those things are, and also want to challenge us to sort of do what you've heard. And that is link these processes that are happening in India, in the Philippines, and Brazil to what's happening in the United States. And I'll just say it. I think that sometimes we're too parochial. Yes, the United States have a particular history, but it's also part of the world. So what are some of those things that's driving us toward authoritarianism? Well, I'm going to name 4. Globalization. Technology, climate change, and migration. Now notice almost all of those things are interactive, and you might add some others, but no one country can actually resolve those things. So even the notion of countries sort of falling into sort of a nationalist stance actually is a model that won't work in the 21st century. And this stress on us and the systems is not going to go away. The pace of change is actually speeding up. And so one of the things authoritarians do consistently is to sort of revert back to a mythical, glorious past. Remember when America was great again? It's like, oh, when was that? Was it 1850, 1950? I was asleep. I don't remember America being great in the sense of achieving its best aspirations. But as we think about the challenge of how do we move forward and what this means in terms of our practice, what this means in terms of our stories, what this means in terms of our institutions, I think we have to keep an eye on not just what we're doing in your neighborhood, in your community, but also what's happening in the world. There's a reason that Steve Bannon, when he left the White House, went to Europe. He sees this as a global movement. And I think we have to too. We are living in a changing world. And the new world demands new practices, new muscles, and new stories. So with that, I want to turn back to the panelists and say, first of all, what gives you hope or what keeps you going? And how do you actually lean into this practice of what's next? Even though we are sometimes pressed for time, like we are now, and under-resourced. So Tarso, I'll start with you and just come down.
Thank you, John, and I'll keep it quick because I know we're short for time. And yeah, Steve Bannon been in Brazil too and was advising the Bolsonaro campaign there, some folks might know. So we are dealing with a global coalition of authoritarianism, among other things. So a couple of things that give me hope and a sense of possibility. I think that there is much more explicit conversation about race and power in this country and in other places. And I think that there are many more people available to us than have been available to us in other periods. I think that the rise of Trump has created conditions where more and more people really wonder whether there's any safety whatsoever. People have long felt fairly comfortable, actually have felt like maybe this is their country, are questioning that. And that's a tremendous opportunity for organizing ourselves and organizing beyond ourselves to build that bigger we. And so I think the opportunities for building solidarity and building power through that solidarity, initially through an ethic of if you come for any of us, you have to come through all of us. And building beyond that to a sense of shared fate and a shared commitment to building power in order to achieve a different fate, I think there's tremendous opportunity. It's there for us if we take it. That's what I think.
Julie?
I too was going to talk about power and the reality that we have power and we need more power. That sometimes, given the way that power has been misused and abused, there can be discomfort in power, and we need to get over that. That really the power for racial justice is the power that we are here to claim. So, big fan of power. And then, Ashley, I love what you were talking about in doing something. That I think that sometimes we get inhibited by the fact that we might not know the exact right thing to do, but that's part of the culture that maintains white supremacy. That we have to be able to create a culture where we are moving towards racial justice, we are experimenting and learning as we go along, and that we're doing it as not as individuals, but as collectives, looking at a cross-sectoral approach, that it's not just about, I talked a lot about government. It's not because I think government is the end-all, be-all, that for us to get to change, we've got to be able to work across multiple sectors, business, philanthropy, the nonprofit industrial complex, got to work cross-sectorally. And then the last thing, just recognizing the power of truth-telling, that we will not be able to get to justice until we can actually tell the truth about our history and about our current reality.
So I'm supposed to spend a minute telling us what we're supposed to do next. I'm gonna ride. Y'all ready? Okay. So I feel hopeful. I mean, you can't be from the South and be of the Southern freedom movement and Black liberation struggles, Black radical traditions, and not be hopeful. We've been surviving some of the worst of conditions across the diaspora for forever, and we're here. I'm the daughter of a woman who was a member of the Black Panther Party, and she's still here. That gives me hope. She is the daughter of a woman, they now call it domestic work. She would have said she was a maid on the Lookout Mountain of Tennessee that Martin Luther King talked about in the I Have a Dream speech, and I'm in front of 3,500 people talking about racial equity. How could I not be hopeful, right? Stacey Abrams, I'm saying this outside of my W-2 work. Y'all know what I'm saying. Is literally fighting for my father's vote to count. For my friend who unexpectedly had a pulmonary embolism and couldn't get to the polls on Tuesday and fought like hell to get an absentee ballot to be able to cast his vote on Tuesday. If Stacey can fight, who the hell am I to not be hopeful, right? And hope is not necessarily the most strategic place to be organizing from right now. Shit is bad. And if it's bad for me, it's bad for Black folks in Palestine, it's clearly bad for my Black trans sisters in Brazil, right? Talking to them about hope. They're like, you from the US, like, what you talking about, hope, right? And it still doesn't give us an excuse to not use our revolutionary visionary muscle. We deserve to dream, it's not a luxury. How can we have a vision that becomes so sexy and contagious that we win if we're not dreaming and hopeful, right? Contradictions exist. So, give us, how many funders in the room still? Did everybody leave? Are there still funders here? Hey, y'all. Y'all know I love you. I want you to be my peer, not just my funder. Give us the resources. That's one next step. Let's roll together. Tarso already talked about it. Solidarity is a practice, y'all. You got to do it. It's not a theory, right? So when you see people coming for Tirana and co-opting her work, be like, wait, pause. Say something, right? When you see white celebrities coming for Linda and Tamika from the Women's March, guess what you're supposed to do? Say something. Flank their leadership, support their organizations, show up to their events, right? That it's not just us showing up for each other when it's convenient, it's showing up in this really, really hard time for each other, right? So let's roll together. Let's not just talk about power as if we all mean the same thing. Because I bet if the question had been, Anat, Ashley, homie, what's power? We would have said very different things. And if we don't have a shared definition, then what are we building towards, right? So let's define power, and then let's not just talk about it, let's build it, right? Let's do it. It's not rocket science, y'all, right? I think when my elders and ancestors said by any means necessary, they meant by all the means. I'm gonna say it one more time because y'all must not have heard me. When my ancestors and elders said by any means necessary, they meant by all the means, right? So for me, as somebody who did the voting thing and was like, that shit don't work, it means being like, and I can't toss that tactic away because guess what? It might fool around and get me a Stacey Abrams. I might fool around with voting and get Amendment 4 in Florida, and all my formerly and currently incarcerated people get their right to vote back. We ain't losing no more elections in Florida. DeSantis better fight like hell, because this is the last opportunity he got, right? Hopefully, Jesus, please, right? So like, let's be real about like not talking shit about the ways that we roll, because imagine if we were all hammers and we were hammering at the same time doing the same thing. That doesn't help us build anything, right? We actually need people doing different parts of the strategy tactically, right? So let's be smart. Let's go as far as we have alignment and not assume that alignment means agreement, right? Let's be smart, because guess what? These white nationalists that Tarso be following and these white supremacist organizations, they don't agree on nothing. Anybody from Charlottesville in the house? Okay, I see you. Guess what? When they did that trash where they went and they killed our comrades, y'all remember that? It was people that were communists and socialists on that white right. And then guess what? It was people that were in anti-communist and anti-socialist organizations at the same time. And guess what they agreed on? Where they had alignment was that they didn't think that black folks and immigrant folks and Jewish folks and queer folks and trans folks and women folks should actually have anything. They were mad because black people in Charlottesville were getting reparations. Did y'all know this? Look it up. So what sense does it make if they have a 50-year strategy that they're 25 years in and they're working with each other across difference, for us not to have a 50-year strategy where we're working together across difference? Let's be smarter. The last thing, and for the good commies in the room, y'all might know what this is. I'm not saying it's my idea, right? But we have to study. We have to be disciplined and rigorous and paying attention to what's happening, right? And what's happened before, because guess what? We cannot make some of the same mistakes. And we can win some of the same wins that have been rolled back, right? So we gotta study. And then we gotta actually move with strategy. We gotta practice some stuff. We gotta experiment with some stuff. We gotta take some risks together. But that's not it. We can't just study and do work and then think that's it. We gotta sum it up and be like, where did we mess up? Where did we rock it? How do we replicate that and take it to a bigger scale, right? And so my hope for us leaving this sacred space that we've built together is that somehow, some way, even if it's at dinner tonight, if it's on the plane rides back, if it's when you get back with your organizations or the municipal governments that you work with, whatever you do, however you get down, that you're figuring out, like, what is our long haul strategy? What are the short-term interventions that we're trying to make? How are we studying to show ourselves approved in the development and implementation of that strategy? And how are we summing up the lessons and sharing them so that we can win? Because that's ultimately our goal, yeah? Y'all want to win some stuff? And then can I ask you for one more thing? I know that's a lot. Can I ask you for one more thing? Can I? Can we make some decisions about what we'll collectively hold together before we see each other at Facing Race again? Right? Can those of us with the power and privilege of being able to be in institutions that can make that demand and hold ourselves accountable to being the vehicles and the stewards of that process, be intentional about that? Because I can't imagine what it would have meant to have all 3,500 of us chasing those ballots in Georgia and Florida this week, right? I can't imagine what will happen if we don't make that decision to ride like that together between now and the next time we would see each other at Facing Race. Okay? So for those of us with institutions that have power and privilege to be able to bring people together to develop those strategies and hold and support them as they implement them, I'm saying Highlanders down, who's with me? Yeah.
I'm a pathological optimist. I think you have to be to stay in this line of work. And perhaps I'll end with some irony, which is that what gives me hope is that I spent the last year in white nationalist chat rooms in the United States, Australia, and the UK at the same time as leading the race-class narrative research. And what's at the gooey center of white nationalism is what you would guess. It's white supremacy. But the next circle, the brand promise, the marketing pitch, beyond that, in all of those geographies, not just our own, is a promise, and I promise, John, I'm not just trying to gain back points so I can have like an invite to your house when we're back in Berkeley, is belonging. That's the promise that they're making the next circle. You will have a place, the world will make sense, you will feel at home, and you will not feel disconnected. There was a book written many years ago by David Rodinger and Kathleen Cleaver called The Wages of Whiteness about the racism in the working class movement. And the wages of whiteness, of course, have been incredibly great, both financially and in every other regard. But there are diminishing returns to whiteness because neoliberalism has become so voracious and all-encompassing that even for white working class people, identification with your race is now becoming less good than the promise that we could make to them of what could be achieved by joining together across racial differences and painting a beautiful tomorrow that I believe us capable of. So what gives me hope is actually, I think we have come to a pivot point where what people are seeking is a place to belong, a place to be together, a place to recognize each other and to be recognized in our full humanity, not as wage slaves and agents of capital. And I think that if we are the holders and we are the deliverers of that beautiful tomorrow, rather than being the narrators of a perpetual litany of horrors, if we begin to run, if you'll forgive the intentional simplification, for class president, if we stop running on the more homework, less recess ticket, and we become the we can have nice things, because I believe we can have nice things, then the attraction to us will be so strong that the repulsion away from neoliberalism and away from a winner takes all and away from you cannot be in your full humanity and an hour after you give birth you're expected back at work, that doesn't benefit anyone of any race. And so that is what gives me hope, that there are diminishing returns on whiteness.
Thank you. So I think this has been very rich. We need to close. We're over time. But I want to leave you with three things very quickly. We're here in Detroit. Many of you know I'm from Detroit. My 98-year-old dad lives down the street. But I also had a friend here who died recently, and she was a friend of mine, and Lori Villarosa's. And I have a picture. Someone just gave me a picture. That's Grace Lee Boggs. And Grace worked for 100 years on these issues, and she's one of our elders. And the book that someone just gave me is a book about love. So she was a pragmatist. She was an organizer, but she also understood that love had to be part of the practice. So I just want to put that out there. And actually, Anat, even if you hadn't said that, you're welcome at my house. But belonging is important. And a plug for our conference in April, Othering and Belonging in Oakland. I hope many of you are there. So we're building something more than things. We're actually creating a larger we, an inclusive we. And I remind myself, and I want to remind you, that we are spiritual animals. And without the spiritual part, we're just animals. Thank you.